I'm here on the job site with Dale, who's a framing contractor.
Hey, good morning.
Dale traded up to Geico Commercial Auto Insurance for all his business vehicles. We're here where he needs us most.
Yep, they sure are.
We make it easy for him to save on all his insurance needs, all in one place, with coverage that fits his business and bottom line. Oh, I shouldn't have looked down.
It's all right.
We're so far up here.
Look at me. Take a deep breath.
Oh, I'm good. So good.
Get a commercial auto insurance quote today at geico.com and see how much you could save. Get more with Geico.
Howdy, folks, and welcome back. Today we're going to be overthinking Superman. This is not a discussion of the current Superman movie that's in theaters now, so no spoilers, no personal commentary about what I thought about the various jokes or side characters. I'll just say, right off the bat, I loved it. I think they rediscovered the formula, Superman is back, and obviously must have been either very good or very bad because it did inspire this entire episode. But again, this episode is not about that movie in particular, but about the cultural history of the character in fiction before 2025, and its origin in 1938, and the cultural milieu that Superman came from out of the late 19th century. The movie was motivating enough to make me go back and reread a bit of Nietzsche. That's always a pain. And most of what I'm going to talk about happened over 100 years ago. So, no spoilers for the 2025 Superman movie, but there may very well be lots of spoilers for the 2013 or 2006 or 1978 Superman movies. So, just fair warning. So my question is, where does this strange character come from? Where does the idea of the Superman come from? And why is this strange alien character so persistently popular? It's difficult to write a compelling Superman story. It's hard to make this bulletproof alien relatable. So why do writers and audiences keep coming back to the next iteration of the character? If you listen to this episode before going to see that movie, it will just set you up to understand why I think this Superman is the real deal from the classic comics, and not this strange character that Henry Cavill has been impersonating for Zack Snyder over the last 10 years or so. Superman movies are not supposed to be very long, and they're not supposed to be weighty and gloomy and philosophical. They're supposed to be fun, campy, exciting, and about the joys of helping people and having the power to be a hero. Meanwhile, Zack Snyder presents us with this sort of conflicted, brooding character that reminds me a little too much of Batman. It just felt a little off to me, even though Henry Cavill is a good actor. It's not his fault. And Zack Snyder is actually a good filmmaker. Watchmen is great. It's just when he gets into the writing side of things, things can get a little off. People should know their strengths, I think. So I think the best way to start off is to listen to a little something that I made based on something that was published in 1896. So you're about to hear something that I used AI to create, but it is based entirely, word for word, on something that was published in 1896. So I did not write this. It was written by an insane German man in 1883, and you're going to hear an English translation that took the world by storm in 1896, and this was 1 year before Bram Stoker's Dracula dominated English pop culture, and only 3 years before The War of the Worlds was published and ushered in the era of science fiction. So, strange things were afoot in pop culture at the time, and when this particular book hit the English-speaking world, it brought a particular word into the vernacular that had not been there before. So let's take a listen.
When Zarathustra was 30 years old, he left his home and went into the mountains. There he enjoyed his spirit and solitude, and for 10 years did not weary of it. But at last, his heart changed, and rising one morning with the rosy dawn, he went before the sun, and he spoke thus unto it.
O great star, what would be your happiness if you had not those for whom you shine? Lo, I am weary of my wisdom, like the bee that has gathered too much honey. I need hands outstretched to take it. Therefore must I descend into the deep, as you do in the evening, when you go behind the sea, and give light also to the netherworld. You exuberant star, like you, must I go down, as men say, to whom I shall descend. Lo, this cup is again going to empty itself, and Zarathustra is again going to be a man.
Thus began Zarathustra's down-going. Zarathustra went down the mountain alone, no one meeting him. When he entered the forest, however, there suddenly stood before him an old man who had left his holy cot to seek roots, and thus spoke the old man to Zarathustra.
No stranger to me is this wanderer. Many years ago passed he by. Zarathustra he was called. A child has Zarathustra become. An awakened one is Zarathustra. What will you do in the land of the sleepers?
Zarathustra answered,
I love mankind.
Why,
said the saint,
did I go into the forest and the desert? Was it not because I loved men far too well? Now I love God. Men I do not love. Man is a thing too imperfect for me. Love to man would be fatal to me.
Zarathustra answered,
What spoke I of love? I am bringing gifts unto men.
Give them nothing.
said the saint.
If, however, you give unto them, give them no more than an alms, and let them also beg for it.
No,
Replied Zarathustra.
I give no alms. I am not poor enough for that. And what does the saint in the forest?
Asked Zarathustra. The saint answered,
I make hymns, and I sing them. And in making hymns I laugh, and I weep, and I mumble. Thus do I praise God. But what do you bring us as a gift?
When Zarathustra had heard these words, he bowed to the saint and said,
What should I have to give you? Let me rather hurry hence, lest I take aught away from you.
And thus they parted from one another, the old man and Zarathustra, laughing like schoolboys. When Zarathustra was alone, however, he said to his heart,
Could it be possible? This old saint in the forest has not yet heard of it? That God is dead?
When Zarathustra arrived at the nearest town, he found that many people had assembled in the marketplace, for it had been announced that a rope dancer would give a performance. And Zarathustra spoke thus unto the people,
I teach you the Superman. Man is something that is to be surpassed. What have you done to surpass man? All beings hitherto have created something beyond themselves. And you want to be the ebb of that great tide? You would rather go back to the beast than to surpass man. What is the ape to man? A laughingstock, a thing of shame. And just the same shall man be to the Superman. A laughingstock, a thing of shame. You have made your way from the worm to man, and much within you is still worm. Once you were apes, And even yet, man is more of an ape than any of the apes. I teach you the Superman. The Superman is the meaning of the earth. Let your will say, the Superman shall be the meaning of the earth.
Wow, well, that was interesting. Someone might call the author of that material the edgelord of all edgelords, Friedrich Nietzsche. Somehow he convinced someone to publish that in 1883. I think the publisher may have lost a bet, but for whatever reason, it was published and now Western civilization is stuck with it. And like a lot of mentally unhealthy people with bad ideas, Nietzsche was extremely influential. Now, what you just heard was a very stodgy English translation. It was originally written in German, and clearly you saw why this relates to the episode. So yes, Nietzsche did come up with a lot of insane, strange ideas, but he did come up with the idea of Superman, basically. I'm going to suggest that Nietzsche was heavily responsible for laying the groundwork of what we call the modern superhero. And I think it was in the wake of Nietzsche understanding and being thoroughly horrified by Charles Darwin's 1859 magnum opus On the Origin of Species. Nietzsche was a preacher's kid, as we'll talk about shortly. He was very concerned about what was going to happen to religion in the wake of the primacy of the theory of evolution in biology and what that was doing to the humanities at the time. So Nietzsche had some very important ideas that had an enormous impact that, believe it or not, despite the goofiness of what you heard, his ideas had this serious, deadly impact on our grandparents' lives, our parents' lives, and ours, in a way that's hard to quantify. Just for example, what we just heard, this book, Thus Spake Zarathustra, inspired, in large part, both what I consider the greatest film ever made, but also the Holocaust. So, as a cultural artifact, or as a meme, as we might say, Nietzsche is central or even formative to the subject of Superman. So if you've ever wanted a sense of why Nietzsche is influential and what his ideas are like, or what his writing is like, without actually having to suffer through reading him like I had to, well then, this episode you'll be getting a little primer, if you will. You'll get a sense of why fussy eggheads always talk about this insane old German man. Now, as you can see, the tone of Nietzsche's work is not happy, fun, hopeful, exciting, or kind. And these are the things, as we'll see, that I think Superman is supposed to be. And so, clearly Nietzsche did not invent the fictional character we know now. As we move forward, you'll see that there are many, many more ugly ideas connected to Nietzsche's Übermensch, which was translated as Superman in English. You can already get a sense that in 1938, when Superman, the fictional superhero, was invented, it was almost a reaction against what that name represented. As we'll see, Nietzsche creates the Superman, but the Superman that we all know and love with the red cape is a decidedly anti-Nietzschean hero. And I think it's fascinating that Nietzsche was, despite his protests, extremely interested in moral philosophy. And I think it's fascinating that both Nietzsche and the comic book writers of Superman see that when you have a being that has a lot of power, that its choices matter more, and so its morality matters more. And I think that the character of Superman comes from a consideration that Abraham Lincoln once made. He said that just about any person can handle adversity. If you really want to test someone's character, give them power. And so Nietzsche and the writers of Superman both intuitively know that if an ordinary human was raised with these amazing powers to be able to shoot heat rays out of his eyes, freeze things by blowing on them with his breath, fly at supersonic speed, a person who can do these things would eventually become corrupted, unfortunately. And this is what we saw in the movie Watchmen, which is great literature. because it does go into human nature, like good literature is supposed to. And it uses the superhero genre to examine human nature. Superman is an examination of human nature, but our American comic book superhero is also a moral hero. He's a moral character. What makes him special is not the fact that he can fly. It's the fact that he has all these powers, but he still chooses to be kind and to do good and not rule over the earth. He just wants his job at the Daily Planet. He just wants to hang out with his girl Lois and keep people safe. So we're not going to go into a lot of detail about Nietzsche's other ideas, at least not in this episode. Today, when we talk about Nietzsche, it's strictly where we meet him on that miserable, tortured road where his life intersects with the hopeful and exciting world of Kal-El, our fictional alien that we know as Superman. In human literature and in human storytelling, super beings with special powers are as old as humans themselves. Maybe the oldest story that we have in its complete form is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which comes from before the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC. It dates to well before then, and we have copies of it on cuneiform tablets. And that's about a Sumerian king named Gilgamesh who had a friend in Enkidu who was like a beast man, and he had special powers, and they went on an adventure together. So the basic idea of a superhero, someone like Hercules, for example, is definitely not new. Nietzsche did not invent that, of course. And so what the heck am I talking about? Well, I'm saying that Nietzsche invented a new kind of super being. He prepared the 20th century to examine power. Hercules and even Moses, for example, the old superpowered beings and heroes of the past were gods or demigods, essentially. They got their powers from a magical cosmic power that permeates the universe and generates life. Now, if this sounds generic and vague, that's because it was, and it's because this is an idea by cultures that had to think of power very generically because they had no idea what lightning was or how muscles worked or why things were heavy. Now, technically, we don't either, but we have the math for why things are heavy at least. They didn't know that our muscles are bundles of little electromagnets and that we use sugar to provide energy to the cycle that activates and deactivates those electromagnets based on signals from our brain. Now, this is something they were starting to figure out in the 19th century, and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a good example of this sort of awakening to the possibilities of science and what happens when we do understand where all this power comes from. A German thinker named Goethe once famously said that there would never be an Isaac Newton for a blade of grass. In other words, Newton came along and demystified the motion of the planets. He demystified how you might get objects into orbit around the Earth. He demystified the rainbow. Someone called it unweaving the rainbow, basically by showing how light diffracts through a prism, and that white light is really made up of all the other colors of light mixed together. Some people found that dreary and offensive. They say he took all the magic away. An even worse offender came along. In 1859, an English gentleman, a naturalist and traveler named Charles Darwin, published On the Origin of Species, suggesting that living things change over time through this thing he's calling natural selection. And in particular, he shows that natural selection is a method for making organisms better at particular things. Now, no human being and no organism is just plain better, whatever that means, than another one. But one organism can definitely be faster than another one, can definitely live longer than another one, can lift more weight than another one. So this gives rise to, unfortunately, another scale of excellence that humans have to worry about. Up through the Middle Ages, humans were worried about the great hierarchy of the universe, of souls, where God is at the top, and non-human animals are at the bottom, and humans and demons and angels are in the netherworld in between. And closeness to God and divine power were scales of excellence that people were concerned about. Well, now we have this very earthly, long time scale of evolution. Now we have to worry, what about beings that are just more evolved than us? They're not more divine, but they're stronger, smarter, have better technology because they're just farther along on this unfolding field of excellence that Charles Darwin was laying out for us. So in other words, the beings that came to conquer Earth in the War of the Worlds in the late 19th century were more powerful than us because they were just simply further along in the timescale of evolution and civilization than us. And so the 20th century became an era of apprehension because we could see that we had some serious problems to fix and that we weren't very far along in the imagined scale of civilizational excellence. And so this leads to a bizarre political and ethical bifurcation that formed in the 20th century. Because on one side, you're starting to have science showing more and more that living things are not equal, and that they are in continual competition with each other for reproduction. We're learning new ways to test and discover new inequalities in humans. But then at the same time, in the late 18th century, and then renewed again in the late 19th century, especially in Western Europe and the United States, you have the idea of political equality. And there was a direct collision between the political and cultural necessity of equality and the bald fact that it was an idea that didn't exist in biology. Now, what happened was, thanks to the Nazis, which were inspired in part by Nietzsche, in the later 20th century, as the horrors of the Holocaust and eugenics came out into the open, our culture was rightly horrified by that, and we retreated from genetics because of the ugliness of racial genetics. It turns out, luckily, racial genetics is something to study, and there are things there to talk about, but what really matters are your individual genetics. So, whether your parents came from, Nigeria or Kenya or Russia or Thailand, can allow for some very general statements to be made about your perhaps genetic future, but what really matters is who were your actual parents. So, to clarify, in my mind, racial genetics, thin, fuzzy statements that are difficult to apply to individuals, but individual genetics do matter. Unfortunately, guys, who our parents are does matter, and it does influence our behavior. Having more than one child will kind of open your eyes to this because you're thinking, wow, these two beings have just slightly different genetics, but the same environment, almost, especially if they're close in age. And yet two siblings can turn out like night and day, despite going to the same school and having the same parents and learning the same cultural messages. So one of the only things I like about Nietzsche is how much he makes people squirm when he throws the ugly facts of life in your face. Genetics determines more about our life than we are comfortable admitting in 2025. And our culture is kind of a giant casino, and it holds a genetic lottery routinely, and then eventually the winners run the casino for no particular reason other than they had the genes that were required. And by the way, what does Zarathustra think about equality? Is that an idea that he ascribes to? I bet you could guess the answer. Let's hear.
Man is a rope stretched between the animal and the Superman. A rope over an abyss. With these preachers of equality, I will not be mixed up and confounded. For thus speaketh justice unto me. Men are not equal, and neither shall they become so. What would be my love to the Superman if I spoke otherwise?
Nietzsche was born the son of a Christian minister in Germany. And because of his upbringing, he had a strong foundation in traditional Western civilization and Orthodox Christianity. But as he began his intellectual career and he ran into Darwin, which was becoming all the rage, he realized that there was a problem. Because Goethe, as we said before, mentioned that there would never be an Isaac Newton for a blade of grass. No one could unweave the rainbow of life and show that, well, no, actually, it's just physics. Well, Darwin got pretty close. He took one big step in that direction. Darwin didn't know about DNA, and so his theory was very incomplete at the time. For example, back then, he talked about, quote-unquote, the missing link. Starting in the 60s, we found too many links. The problem now is human evolution is a bit of a mess. We have too many transitional forms, not too few. But even at the time, Darwin's evidence was on point, and other scientists had to pay attention to what he was saying. Now, Nietzsche was a philosopher, and in particular, a moral philosopher, despite his protests to the contrary. And he was very concerned with how industrialism and Marxism and this new evolutionary theory in biology was going to change culture, and for the worse. And so when Nietzsche talks about God being dead, notice he doesn't say there is no God. Earlier, when we heard that sketch, Zarathustra didn't say, wow, doesn't that saint know that there is no God? He said God is dead, which is designed, I think, to strike your ears harder. It's designed to have an emotional effect on you. As you can see, Nietzsche likes to push people's buttons. And so what he's saying is that God may exist, but he's sort of left the building when it comes to Western civilization. That culture had reached a point where you couldn't have laws based on the will of God anymore. The only laws that could exist had to be based on the will of humans. And Nietzsche thought that that would never work. Nietzsche thought that humans were going to have to come up with a new kind of morality, a new kind of vision for the future in order to make civilization work, to make it continue. And it's ironic to say that Nietzsche was disturbed by the theory of evolution because he more or less co-opted it into his entire new moral system, or at least his call for a new moral system. His central idea was that the purpose of life is, to some extent, Darwinian evolution. For Nietzsche, life wasn't about spiritual enlightenment or finding your way into the afterlife. It's about survival, winning competitions, becoming stronger, and enforcing your will on the other organisms and the universe around you. It's about developing new strengths, overmastering the environment, control, progress, evolution. So, as you might imagine, 1859, Charles Darwin's book hits the streets. Nietzsche didn't make a huge impact in 1883 because of his old-fashioned German, but in 1896, Thus Spoke Zarathustra hits the English-speaking world. The word Superman becomes very influential. In 1903, there was a play by the playwright George Bernard Shaw called Man and Superman. Now, his play had nothing to do with Nietzsche or a superpowered character, but it definitely shows that the word was in the vernacular and it kept the word floating around in popular culture. And then in the late 1930s, that's when the fictional character that we know as Superman was invented by two Jewish immigrants in New York. And it's pretty clear that the historical figure of Moses, who's one of those superpowered beings I mentioned earlier, was the template for Superman, because Superman had genetics from another world. He was not genetically who he thought he was, and his connection to that other culture that he was separated from is what gives him his power. And of course, Moses is an Egyptian name. And so a part of Moses' origin story was realizing that he was not actually Egyptian, that he had been placed in that basket on the river by his biological Jewish parents. And his reconnection with that heritage is what made him the powerful figure he became. If we know anything about Superman's origin story, we know that that sounds familiar. So now let's hear a little bit more of Zarathustra talking about the Superman.
Once, blasphemy against God was the greatest blasphemy. But God died, and therewith also the blasphemers. To blaspheme the earth is now the dreadfulest sin. And to rate the heart of the unknowable higher than the meaning of the earth. But you also, my brothers, tell me, what does your body say about your soul? Is your soul not poverty and pollution and wretched self-complacency? Verily, a polluted stream is man. One must be a sea to receive a polluted stream without becoming impure. Lo, I teach you the Superman. He is that sea. In him can your great contempt be submerged. What is the greatest thing you can experience? It is the hour of great contempt. The hour in which even your happiness becomes loathsome unto you, and so also your reason and your virtue. The hour when you say, "What good is my reason? Does it long for knowledge as the lion for his food?" It is poverty and pollution and wretched self-complacency. The hour when you say, "What good is my virtue? As yet, it has not made me passionate. How weary I am of my good and my bad. It is all poverty and pollution and wretched self-complacency. It is not your sin. It is your self-satisfaction that cries up to heaven. Your very sparingness in sin cries up to heaven. Where is the lightning to lick you with its tongue? Where is the frenzy with which you should be inoculated? Lo, I teach you the Superman. He is that lightning. He is that frenzy.
And so, in part due to claptrap like that, this idea of the Superman who would lead humankind to a better future stuck in the popular imagination. And I think it's beautiful and ironic that two Americans created a character that was very anti-Nietzschean. And notice, as you've seen, this ugly, dark quality in Nietzsche's writing. Nietzsche doesn't like people. He particularly doesn't like women, as we'll see, or Jews. And so his writings influenced a lot of ideas and movements that we would be repulsed by. And then these two Americans take this name and assign it to a being that is essentially the apotheosis of traditional values. He's not here to change human morality or bring in his own ideas of how we should live. He embraced the culture that was handed down to him by his parents in Kansas. He's not destroying anything. He's not replacing man. He's not even choosing to exercise his will to power, to control. Superman wants to live and let live. He likes his job at the Daily Planet. He wants to hang out with his best girl, Lois Lane, solve mysteries with his friend, Jimmy Olsen. And so Superman is supposed to be this strange inversion of Nietzsche's idea. The character that we know of as Superman, whom I was introduced to in 1978. As I said in an earlier episode, I was too young to remember seeing Star Wars in 1977. I wasn't even 2 years old yet. My mother says I slept through most of it. But I do have strong memories of seeing Richard Donner's Superman movie in 1978, starring, of course, Christopher Reeve. It was released on December 10th, 1978. And so I was well into being 3 years old, just old enough for me to have vague memories of going to the old-fashioned theater in San Diego, which is where my family lived at the time, even though my mother's family is from Texas. Richard Donner's movie hit me hard because I was too young to be into the comic books at the time, and so I didn't have a whole lot of experience with Superman other than seeing some of the old black and white TV show from the 50s, and that didn't do much for me. I was more into Wonder Woman because she had a TV series at the time that I liked to watch. Richard Donner was focused on bringing the Superman character to life using the special effects at the time. So there was no CGI. And so it was more difficult to do the flying scenes and show some of Superman's superpowers. And so partly because of that, a lot of the extravagance and the side characters and the strange technology was stripped out of the mythos for the 1978 movie because, well, Richard Donner wanted it to be our world in 1978, and we wanted to watch Superman trying to figure it out. It was a fish out of water movie. It was our world, and we watched Christopher Reeve's Superman try to fit into it. This new movie takes a different approach. It's basically Golden Era Superman comics. That's the feel. It's a frenetic feel with lots of fast-moving plot points and side characters and complications because the best Superman plots are complicated because how else are you going to put Superman in a corner? If it's just a bad guy who wants to rule the world, usually Superman can just go punch him in the face and the movie's over. So Superman stories always had sort of a higher bar because a Batman story is a lot easier to write because then you've got a character who can totally die if he just slips off one of those buildings. He's not bulletproof. You have to explain how in the world Bruce Wayne does what he does. Where with Superman, he is an invitation to lazy writing if you're not careful. Well, I loved it that he had this essential good nature, that he was even looking out for the bad guy in some situations. It was very disarming to see a powerful being choose to use its power that way. And it was inspiring. It was, I think, the anti-Nietzschean element of it, the embracing of tradition and kindness and live and let live, I think was very inspiring. So how inspired was I by Christopher Reeve's Superman? Well, I was determined to have my own Superman costume. Why not? It would help me focus on becoming more like that character. So, of course, at the time I had to enlist my mother's help. And let's just start from the ground up. So I couldn't find red boots that fit that I thought would work. I mean, there were all kinds of dumpy looking shiny red plastic galoshes that I could wear. So I opted for just bright red athletic socks that I would just pull up to my calf and hope that from a distance they looked enough like boots. Then I had the baby blue tights, the red tight shorts over the top of that with the yellow belt. I did manage to find a long sleeve blue t-shirt with the Superman logo on the front. So the only thing that was left was the cape. So my mother took me to the fabric shop and bought the fabric, and she made a cape. Now, most kids at the time would have just tied two corners of the cloth around their neck to make their cape. But if you go back and you look at the production stills, that is not how the costume worked. The cape sort of comes out of the collar of the shirt. And so I had my mother help me tuck the cape into the collar and then pin it so that it flowed out of the collar the way Christopher Reeves did in the actual movie. And so I'd go out in the front yard and stand or run around, and apparently kids from the neighborhood would come by asking to see Superman, and so I'd have to run and change into my costume and come running out into the front yard with my cape flowing behind me. Apparently it was quite a sight. But there was one problem. It was bad enough I didn't have blue eyes, and so I couldn't look like Clark Kent in that way. Maybe that's another reason why I ended up gravitating toward Batman. Maybe because Bruce Wayne had brown hair and brown eyes. But Superman had very dark, sort of jet black hair and bright blue eyes. That was his look. I did have pretty much jet black hair because before puberty, my hair was very native, as in very sort of flat and straight and dark. And so that caused a problem because I wanted that curl. I wanted that little bit of hair curling down over my forehead. And I kept making a big deal out of it until my mother, who worked as a hairstylist, brought me to where she worked, and her friend and the manager of the place worked on trying to get a curl to stay in my hair. And one of my earliest memories is sitting in that salon, and I remember loving the way it smelled. It was like this bizarre chemical smells, and I was reading magazines, sitting there at 3 years old, and I remember the front part of my hair was folded up in aluminum foil because they were trying to get it to stay curled, but didn't happen. Now, ironically, around the time I hit puberty, my hair lightened up a bit. It got more dark brown rather than, a black kind of situation. And it started to get wavy and sort of lighter in texture rather than floppy and straight like it was. So I could get the curl then, but by the time I was, 14, I was a Batman fan and didn't care about the curl anymore. I was, working on my Taekwondo moves. And speaking of puberty, let's listen to Nietzsche talking about women and how they relate to his idea of the Superman. And let me stress one more time, I did not write this, folks. Not a single word. This is entirely from Mr. Nietzsche. I do think it's important for people to understand these ideas and know that they were out there. And it's fascinating to think how they're connected to the history of a character we love so much. Let's take a listen. What should men and women be doing with their lives, according to Nietzsche?
Man shall be trained for war, and woman for the recreation of the warrior. All else is folly. Fruits that are too sweet, these the warrior likes not. Therefore likes he woman. Bitter is even the sweetest woman. Better than man does woman understand children, but man is more childish than woman. In the true man, there is a child hidden. It wants to play. Up then, you women, and discover the child in man. A plaything let woman be, pure and fine like the precious stone, illumined with the virtues of a world not yet come. Let the beam of a star shine in your love. Let your hope say, may I give birth to the Superman.
Now, the next major cinematic adaptation of Superman was in the 2010s when the DC universe decided to bring in Superman. They hired a writer/filmmaker named Zack Snyder to usher in this new era. They hired a British actor named Henry Cavill, and he definitely looks the part. He's a good actor. He has some comic timing. It did show that his Clark Kent could have been much better given different writing. And let me say first that also Zack Snyder, I think, is a capable filmmaker. Watchmen, his movie from 2008, is great. Now, he did not write it, and that's part of my point, is when Zack Snyder works from great material, he can build a really memorable, visual narrative around that. When Zack Snyder tries to impart his own ideas to the script, that's when he struggles. Snyder has some rather extreme personal beliefs. He's not quite in the Overton window. He's a huge fan of Nietzsche, by the way, and Ayn Rand. And it shows. His Superman is conflicted about whether or not he should even help man. And he definitely sees himself as overhumans, and normal morality doesn't really apply to him. He never says that. Zack Snyder's Superman never actually says that, but when you see his reactions to death, and it doesn't seem to register when lots of humans are dying. There are times in the movie where, while he's fighting General Zod, he just sort of callously disregards people being crushed. It just doesn't seem to reflect the character very well. He's always debating about whether or not to help people because he's, scared to show himself. It's an amoral and individualistic and elitist kind of approach to Superman, I think. But I think we're looking culturally for another kind of hero now. I don't think we need more Nietzsche. But unfortunately, we're going to get a little more Nietzsche right now. We're going to talk about the last man. Nietzsche talked about the last generation of humans before they were replaced by the Superman. And they're sort of a sad, navel-gazing crew. Let's hear more about what Nietzsche thinks of the last man. And unfortunately, this all sounds very familiar.
It is time for man to fix his goal. It is time for man to plant the germ of his highest hope. Alas, there comes a time when man will no longer launch the arrow of his longing beyond man, and the string of his bow will have unlearned to whiz. Alas, there comes a time when man will no longer give birth to any star. Alas, there comes a time of the most despicable man, the man who can no longer despise himself. Lo, I show you the last man. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? So asks the last man, and he blinks. The earth has then become small, and on it there hops the last man who makes everything small. His species is ineradicable like that of the ground flea. The last man lives the longest. We have discovered happiness, say the last men, and blink thereby. A little poison now and then, that makes pleasant dreams, and much poison at the last, for a pleasant death. One still works, for work is a pastime, but one is careful lest the pastime should hurt one. One no longer becomes poor or rich, both are burdensome. Who still wants to rule? Who still wants to obey? Both are too burdensome. No shepherd, and one herd. Everyone wants the same. Everyone is equal. He who has other sentiments goes voluntarily into the madhouse. Formerly all the world was insane. Say the subtlest of them, and they blink thereby. They are clever, and they know all that has happened. They have their little pleasures for the day, and their little pleasures for the night. But they have a regard for health. We have discovered happiness, say the last men, and blink thereby.
And I think that the quest for happiness, the urge to go out and discover happiness, is important. I think Nietzsche ends with that note for a reason, because Aristotle warned us that happiness is the one goal that you can never reach if you're aiming at it. Happiness is an accidental byproduct, a side effect of living well. Now, what does that mean to live well? Well, then Aristotle wrote entire books about that, but the point is, you don't go out and seek happiness. You go out and find out what you're supposed to be doing. You do your duty. You do the right thing, and happiness will come later. if you seek your happiness now, you're going to be anxious and miserable your whole life. And this brings us to the new Superman movie by writer-director James Gunn. He's most famous for the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. And this movie is hopeful precisely because we're seeing a character who does not care about his own happiness or fulfillment. He's concerned with, how should I be using my power? What should I be doing with my life? And it very much has nothing to do with being happy. And so now a few things I'll say about the movie, and I'm very careful here. First, let's define what a spoiler is. I think that if I tell you that in this Superman movie, there's a character named Lois Lane, who is a journalist, hopefully that's not a spoiler. Now, if I explain to you how her journalism might help Superman fight the bad guy, or what the bad guy's up to, well, then that's a spoiler. Hopefully it's not a spoiler to say that we find out that this Superman guy is actually living among us as someone named Clark Kent, and he grew up on a farm in Kansas, and then he moved to a city called Metropolis. But let's talk about his costume, for example. I think this is a good example of the difference between the Zack Snyder Superman and this new one. Zack Snyder's Superman didn't have the little red shorts that I went through so much trouble to procure when I was 3. So as a 3-year-old, I could find the shorts, but Zack Snyder couldn't. I mean, come on. So Superman is all blue from the chest down, basically. Now, the question was, are they going to bring back those dorky-looking red shorts? And yes, they did. And the central idea that I heard from an interview with the director was, it occurred to them that their Superman, their golden era true Superman, has zero interest in being cool or intimidating. Why would he care? And in the comics tradition, his mother designed the suit. And so he's not going to hurt his mother's feelings by changing the design. I mean, he's going to wear it. That's the kind of guy he is. He's not interested in philosophy or electronics or politics like Bruce Wayne. He's interested in peanut butter and baseball and punk rock. And when he's uncertain about himself, he wants to know what his dad thinks. The main thing I want to say about the movie is that it's only 2 hours and 9 minutes. It's not a bladder-busting epic, as you might say. It's fun. It inspires you not to be more badass, but to be a better person. I mean, it's not the Superman story. It's a Superman story. We're being introduced to his world and all the strange things that fit into his world. And it's a definite opening to a whole new cinematic universe. So I'm definitely going to see it again. So there's my recommendation. And so our last bit of Nietzsche is fitting because it sets up the villain. Nietzsche suggests that the last men will fight Superman to the death. They're going to hate him. And so let's say goodbye to Nietzsche with this next passage, and then we'll wrap it up.
So alien are you in your souls to what is great, that to you, the Superman would be frightful in his goodness. And you wise and knowing ones, you would flee from the solar glow of the wisdom in which the Superman joyfully bathes his nakedness. You highest men who have come within my ken, this is my doubt of you and my secret laughter. I suspect you would call my Superman a devil. I became tired of those highest and best ones. From their height did I long to be up, out, and away to the Superman.
So, was Nietzsche anticipating Lex Luthor? He does suggest that Superman would definitely have enemies. However, it seems to me that the enemy of Nietzsche's Superman would be a hero. And so, and in some sense, the traditional representation of Lex Luthor is somewhere between Nietzsche's Superman or maybe even Nietzsche's last man. Maybe Lex Luthor is one of the last men. And so there are a couple of things that are still Nietzschean about Superman, and that's his down-to-earth quality. Superman doesn't appear to be trying to save people's souls to make sure they have a better afterlife. He doesn't mention the afterlife. He doesn't mention God. We're unclear about his beliefs in that area. However, he isn't just trying to save people's bodies either. There are multiple times when he's ready to trust someone. He's ready to give someone a second chance. He's ready to reach out with an olive branch and try to de-escalate the situation. And to me, that represents the true character of Kal-El / Clark Kent, aka Superman. I wanted to make an episode about this because I see this movie as culturally significant, in the same way that the 1978 movie was culturally significant. There are no groundbreaking special effects in this movie. It's not even the greatest movie ever made, don't get me wrong. I think it's a great superhero movie, a great Superman movie that gets the character exactly right. But beyond that, feel free to disagree with me if you watch it. But it has a central anti-Nietzschean message about kindness and about preserving basic moral virtues rather than tossing them aside because they're no longer convenient in a world governed by internet trolls and scam artists. So it's a hopeful movie, and that's something that I think we need now. I hope this episode has encouraged you to think about the character and maybe give superhero movies another chance. There's been some really terrible ones lately, so I don't blame you for staying away. Keep trying to surpass man in the meantime. Keep firing your arrows beyond mankind. Let's usher in the Superman, people. Let's get this done. Talk to you later.